And now, the Whiskey and Cigarettes Podcast with your hosts, Tina Kilberg and Tim Chessman, sponsored by Tanya Tanning Butter, 96 MFK, Hit Radio Los Angeles, and Tarryton Cigarettes. And today, our focus is the one and only Miss Tate.
Miss Tate. And for a reference, for cultural reference or pop culture reference, Taryn cigarettes or whatever they're called were apparently allegedly the cigarettes that Sharon smoked. So we have
That
to
is
be promoting
correct.
those,
That is
right?
correct. That was not an
And the
accident.
tan for the commercial that she did early on in her career. So
Yep,
this is what we're meant to be doing today.
I think
There's so
so.
many personalities, and I think it would be very difficult to talk a bit about everyone in every episode. So the thing is, sorry about that, just got a notification from Final Draft. I quit Final Draft, so my connection would be better. Final Draft is the screenwriting app that I use. I no
Okay.
longer use Celtics. Anyway, so what did I want to say? Yes, I think we're going to devote this episode to Sharon Tate. We did briefly mention before beginning this recording call for today that it would be great to talk about all the events that took place and devote it into different episodes where we could go through timelines and actually talk a bit about everyone. But because there were so many people and there's more people to explore, we thought it would be a good idea to do an episode on Sharon Tate, on reclaiming her story and talking more about her.
Absolutely. Her
Yeah,
life. Her life.
sure.
I,
Yes.
I think maybe we should start, since you've been studying her a lot longer, maybe you should talk about how you came to find out about her. Um, I came about because I,
Um,
with the film from Tarantino and then really dug in, but you knew her, you found her way before then. So maybe you might want to talk about how you came across her.
sure. Well, I discovered her in 2011, around 2011. And the way I discovered her was actually not very different from the way most people discover nowadays. So we do know that the ugly side is perhaps her image being locked in death and being associated with death and with murder. But I think another a bit maybe toxic take is being famous for her aesthetic. And I
Right.
think even though Tarantino paved the way for introducing this person to young people and essentially creating a new fan base for her, a lot of, and I see this a lot online on Instagram, TikTok, everywhere, even Pinterest, they romanticize her style and her aesthetic. They will try and dress like her. They will try and do their makeup like her. So I kind of want to shift the lens to her life, her spirit, her ambitions, who she was as a person rather than as a style icon, because I think that's very limiting. And as beautiful as 60s eye makeup is, which was actually popularized by Twiggy, not Sharon Tate, I think if people genuinely knew about Sharon, they would know that her best styling advice would be to be a modern person of your time, a modern actress of your time. Because there are, actors and people in the public sphere of things that like to emulate her a lot, whether it's Lily Rose Depp or Margot Robbie, probably for the promotional purposes of the film, which was
Yeah.
probably her agenda. She did the same with Barbie. But I think, the 60s eye makeup is beautiful, but it's the 1960s. It's not modern. If Sharon Tate was alive today, she would not be doing that makeup trend. She would be more modern. She would keep up with the
Sure.
trends. And I think it's important for people, not just actresses or musicians, but it's very important for women and maybe even men to be modern in your
Hmm.
style.
Sure.
Don't look at style from 60 years ago. Look what's in 2025 and emulate that, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's all a good point. And someone like her, would be beautiful in the 1800s. Just she in any era, she just would be. But you're right about our goal, and as you talked about with the series, is to go beyond a couple different things. Number one, just the beauty aesthetic. She's beautiful. Of course she is. Anybody can see that. Beyond the beauty aesthetic and beyond the way that she left the world. because everything, mostly what you read about her anywhere now, is about one of those two things: the style icon, beauty aesthetic, oh my God, wasn't she pretty, or the way she died. What people tend to miss is everything else. Her story, her life. Like we said last episode, she packed a lot of living into 26 years. I mean, 6 major movies, several television appearances, hundreds of photo shoots, hundreds of interviews, traveled the world, fell in and out of love. She lived a full life, if you could put it that way, in just that brief amount of time. And beyond that, she was a good person. Hollywood and ever is full of beautiful women. Always has been. She was a good person too. Not to deify, like we said last time, don't deify, don't demonize. We're not trying to deify her.
That's going to be our new slogan. I love the fact that you came up with that.
Yeah,
I love
we
the
don't
fact
want
that
to
you came
deify
up
or
with that.
demonize. But it's interesting to note that even during her time while she was alive, other people in Hollywood had nothing bad to say about her. Can you imagine that? An actress or actor not having any real enemies, people not trying to sabotage her or being cruel to her. If you go back and talk to people who knew her, even then, while she was living, there wasn't really a bad word to say about her. I think the worst anybody could say was that she was naive, which as a 26-year-old, that's pretty much expected. But she did have some pretty significant insights into her own fame and the status of her fame. And she really kind of saw right through it, a lot of it. She didn't play it up, didn't believe in the hype. I think she really stayed
I mean,
herself.
I think it's very easy. It's also very easy for everyone to instantly run and say all the best things they could possibly say about her after her death, because even some of her friends lied and said that they were invited to her home that night to be associated.
That's a whole other.
So I don't necessarily think she didn't have enemies, because she was a human being. I don't necessarily think she got along with everyone, liked everyone 100%.
Oh, no, of course.
I do believe she had enemies. I would say that her enemies were probably the women that had affairs with her husband. I would say maybe those were her enemies.
Sure, absolutely.
And we just know a few of them. I would say that maybe not necessarily enemies, but she did have a very rough time with Marty Ransohoff, which we'll talk about in more detail. And I think the best decision she ever made on behalf of taking, Roman's advice out of all people was to no longer seek representation from them, to become independent and look into her own work and stuff. And she eventually got into European films more, but we'll talk about that in a bit, because I do want to kind of go through all of that in terms of her development in her career and how she got established. But before we do that, I think we have to address the big elephant in the room, not necessarily in this room or in your room, but the room being the entertainment industry. And that is the problem with most Hollywood biopics and biopic depictions of Sharon Tate. We will address Once Upon a Time in Hollywood in a minute, because there could be a fair argument that she was portrayed as a living person in that. Not exactly accurate completely in terms of history, but we'll get back to that. The problem with most Hollywood biopics is that could you hear that?
Yes.
Could you hear Siri?
No.
Okay.
I hear you fine.
Okay. It's frustrating. Siri automatically quotes everything I say and tries to search things on Google for me. That was a bit strange. So the problem with most Hollywood biopics is that every actress who has portrayed Sharon Tate, for the most part, has portrayed a version of a woman anticipating death. Nobody has played a version of Sharon who is alive. And portraying anyone, through the lens of death is the most limiting version of legacy there is.
Absolutely.
And we can see that through JFK, through Marilyn Monroe, through all of these people. Okay. So for the most part, I find Sharon Tate portrayals in films useless, because I don't think any actress has played her from a true place or a version of Sharon who is very much alive. everyone has played a timid version of Sharon, fearing, perhaps even anticipating and expecting death,
Mhm.
which those few moments, those last few moments of her life, do not stand true, and do not speak of who she was as a
Absolutely.
person.
Yeah, that's really well put. That is really well put. I
Yeah.
think
So
I
and I think this was something that I told Teresa, in fact,
right.
when we did our first Zoom call last year, and so Teresa is a lovely girl
Yes.
who will be portraying Sharon, and no one can take her from me. She's mine.
No,
So
no. Well,
I'm happy. Yeah.
again, the thing that struck me about her
Yeah.
when we worked together last year for the first time was her spirit. She has, like Sharon, she has a really beautiful inner presence about her, a really gentle
Yeah.
spirit, very kind person. And that's what I think, like you said, the one-dimensional portrayals of her in the past have missed. Now, I will say, now, as you know, I love Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Guilty, Rick Dalton, all the way. I think, yeah, there were. It was such a cool movie. There were, I think, to be fair, Margot probably got as close to portraying her as a living person as anyone else did yet. There were, of course, issues with some of it, of course, but I think she's the only one that portrayed her significantly removed from death, because she doesn't die in that movie. So I think
That's fair.
that's the best one so far. The other ones leave a lot to be desired, and the other ones don't do her justice at all, because, like you
Yeah.
said, they anticipate death. So everything else is
Right.
missed. Her whole life they just gloss over.
Right. Well, even though Tarantino's film touched on her, she was still filtered through more or less nostalgia and loss.
Hmm.
Because I think the difference was most portrayals focus on what happened to her, not who she was.
Right.
And I suppose, but I suppose with Tarantino, I think what I didn't like was that there's this danger of retroactive myth making, and he does this more in his book, where he even sexualizes her in some segments. We treat the person like a symbol or an aesthetic of something, of a fantasy, of a beauty ideal, a fashion ideal, rather than as an artist or as a woman.
Hmm.
And I think
That's
even though it
true.
was important that he avoided the anticipation of death lens by actually showing a crime scene, because that would flatten her performance. I do think that with Tarantino, Sharon was more of a symbol of lost potential, because I think what he attempted to do, you could say, is maybe what a real Sharon Tate biopic should look like. Maybe it could have
Right.
been seen as a proposal showing joy, humor, talent, gentleness, and strength. The film, to a certain degree, tried to touch upon these things. But here's the thing: she was reduced to a silent symbol. And I think the biggest criticism that the film faced was that Sharon had few lines and minimal dialogue in the film. And
Well,
this was
she
an
wasn't a
ongoing
main character.
critique.
That's true. That's
Yeah,
true.
this
She
was an
was
ongoing critique that Quentin had to address when he went to promote the film.
right.
And I believe Margot had to come to his defense at one point when they were doing a conference speech where they had to address this, why she had limited time. So I would say, I don't know if I would say that she was portrayed as a ghost, because she just kind of came in, came out, but she was portrayed more as a fantasy rather as a living person, because I think the film really celebrated her being a symbol of innocence lost, that part of the 60s.
Mhm. And
And I think it's too much.
it wasn't
Yeah,
even a story. It was the Rick and Cliff story. That was the main
right. Which
thing.
was, and Rick and Cliff was excellent. Don't get
Oh,
me wrong.
absolutely.
Rick and Cliff was excellent. But the thing is, I think her portrayal was very passive, and it's not good enough to reflect Tate as the vibrant, witty, funny, emotionally rich personality that
And
she
I
was,
don't
that she
think that
was
was
known as.
Clinton's intention. I don't think he wanted to do that with that movie. The
Oh
story he
yeah,
wanted to tell was Rick and Cliff with this other kind of cool backdrop, which I think he succeeded in doing.
absolutely.
What we're doing that's different
Yeah,
is we want to portray her as a whole person, which I'm not going
right.
to spoil it here. I'm not going to spoil it here, but I am so glad we agreed upon the ending for the
Yeah, you
last
can't
episode
mention
she's
it.
in. No, I won't. But it's if it
Yeah.
works, it's going to be beautiful. It's going to leave people with a positive impression of her as a living person, and not the way everything else has
Yeah.
addressed her.
I will say there are just a few things I want to mention about Tarantino's version of Sharon and Margot's portrayal before we actually get into the actual woman. It was more of a fantasy projection in my mind, because I think he just focused on a sweet presence that he could use to build an alternative history of the Manson murders, which is something that he's done before with
Sure.
Inglourious
And
Bastards. He
very
did the same
effectively.
with killing the Nazis, right? And
Sure.
killing
Yeah.
Hitler. He
He's done
created
that
all,
very
he does
effectively.
this. Right. So, but I do think that the film really avoided any deep engagement with Sharon's legacy. A lot of
True.
things were left unexplored, which makes sense. She was a side character. And perhaps it was better that way, because even with the clips of her going to the cinema theater to watch The Wrecking Crew was released in December 1968. So I'm
No,
actually not sure
no,
if
actually not.
they...
I think at least over here it was released in January or February of '69. So that was historically
Of
accurate.
69?
Yeah.
Okay.
It would have been in
filmed,
the theater.
right.
He went to
Well,
go see it.
what wasn't historically accurate was, well, actually, it wouldn't have been historically accurate, Tim, because during that time, well, the way Tarantino filmed it was during the summer, right? Because that scene was following up August
No, that would have
1969.
been
So
February. That was still February
February?
when she went to
Okay.
go
Well,
see it.
you're playing devil's advocate for Tarantino, because from March onwards, she was filming in Italy.
Yeah, that wasn't true. That was wrong.
So
Yeah.
it would have to be, in Tarantino's defense, it would have to be February 1969 where she went to the theater.
Which she did. And that's when that movie was in the theater. So that was historically true.
Right. Well, it was historically true, but let's talk about the Playboy Mansion. So we see
I
her
think that
celebrating,
was,
having
I
parties
don't
at
know
the
how true
Playboy
that was. I
Mansion.
think that was
That
made
is
up.
historically inaccurate, because Hugh Hefner didn't purchase that until 1971. And that was the first things that I had to fact check early on when I was doing research, because something about the performance just didn't stand right with me. And I think also there's a scene in the Playboy Mansion where she conducts very salacious dancing, which not only doesn't really match Sharon's natural demeanor and dancing style if you watch old footage, but suggestive dancing also appeals more to the male gaze. It wasn't lighthearted, elegant, free-spirited. Her expressions were over-exaggerated as well. I think they were too forced, and the accent was awful. I don't know what Deborah was on about. Praising Margot's performance, she did not sound one bit about Sharon. And we could actually break down and talk about Sharon's voice and cadence.
That's true, because that is,
yeah.
she had a unique way of speaking, which we talked about a couple of years ago, actually. It was the blend of, like West Coast hottie and sophisticated European.
I love the fact that you always mention that you always mention
it kind of is, because she spent a
Yeah.
lot of her life in Europe, which for someone that age at that time was unusual, who had been born in America. So when she
Yes.
spoke, she did have that light, kind of breezy, little bit air of sophistication to her voice, coupled with like the West Coast hot girl. So her voice kind of blends both of those, and that's going to be a tricky thing to get accurate, but I think we do need to get it right, because that was part of who she was.
Yes, and also I would say that well, the first thing is that she took a lot of voice classes, and
yeah, true.
I think what was very frustrating for her was that Marty Ranzahoff, her agent, and MGM and Filmways, they were delaying her success. They weren't trusting her completely. They would let her do small portrayals here and there, but she wouldn't work for 3 years. She did all this training, and then she lands her breakout role, which is a small role. It wasn't the protagonist role, essentially. It was more or less, it wasn't the main role, let's say, for Eye of the Devil, and yet they dubbed her voice and used an actress to do a deeper voice for that film.
Now that's funny, because
those years of training.
I've seen conflicting reports on that. The prevailing wisdom, I think, is that they did dub her voice. Some have said they didn't, or they didn't dub all of it for the whole performance. So I don't know.
I have found clips of her original voice and the dubbed version.
Okay.
And it's actually an Instagram video. I'm going to find it because I must have posted it somewhere on Twitter. I treat Twitter like all I have to do is search myself and find anything relating to the script, all the sources. I tend to post things on Twitter. So I will find that link where you can see the comparison with her natural voice and the dubbed version.
This is where your really thorough research skills come in really handy, because I did not know that.
Yes. Oh, I have to send it to you. It's literally a clip where you hear her natural voice, warm light, that soft melodic quality that she naturally has, and then the deeper voice. So you'll see it for yourself. But I guess
the voice is going to be important for us to get right, because that's something I think even in any portrayal, the voice hasn't really been worked on to get it right.
That's the problem with most portrayals.
Yeah.
Look, I think I'm actually not that interested in a person looking 100% like the person they're going to portray. And I'm not just talking about Sharon.
Let's be honest.
I'm talking about anyone
Nobody looks
portraying
like that.
anyone in a biopic. Nobody
looks like that. They don't have to look exactly like the person, but they have to have, at least in terms of her, we agreed, they have to have the right spirit.
Yes.
And that's the other thing that I think the other actresses who have played her have not nailed, is her spirit. They have to have that gentle quality to her. And Teresa has it. It's the first thing I noticed working with her. Like I talked to you right away. I said, oh my God, I think I found a girl who could do this. And I'm glad that you agreed.
Absolutely, yes.
They need that gentle quality to them. It has to be real. Otherwise it won't work.
Well, I think the easiest way to look like someone is to sound like them. And I don't know if you might know about this more than I do, but I generally believe, well, there's there's the mouth acting, the mouth acting trend on TikTok, where there's people imitating different actors, but it's very good. And the secret is, it's all about your lips and your lip muscles. And I think a lot of people,
I don't know about TikTok videos. I've been doing impressions since the 80s, so I don't know.
That's fair. That's fair. But I do generally think that instead of focusing so much on the eyes and exaggerating expressions on the eyes, I do think if actors can control their mouths and their lip muscles, it changes everything. Because the way you speak, it's not just about having a youthful, almost airy nature in your voice or speaking at a moderate pace. Any actress could be instructed to do that, to try and emulate her, not too fast, not too slow, with a natural and effortless flow. But what's important is that you really have to study the demeanor of a person, and the way you speak kind of give signals things about your personality. Her voice, that soft melodic quality, kind of reflects her own person as a calm and relaxed girl demeanor. So it kind of can tell us more about her character and is more indicative of her personality. I also think that, I don't know if you've noticed this, but I always noticed that there was a slight British tinge, should I say, to her voice in some early interviews. And they would ask her where she was from, because they didn't know where she was from. And the smart thing about MGM and Filmways was that they would train her and take her to London. And then when these Americans went to the UK to interview her, and she took one of those guys to Carnaby Street, I don't know if you remember that 1965 interview where so he actually asked her, he said, oh, you're actually from America. You're actually from Texas. We thought you were British. And that is smart, rather than just taking 1 in a million American girls. There are already enough American starlets. Taking her to Europe was actually a smart idea. And then her,
I think you could call that accent transatlantic, if you really want to try transatlantic. It's kind of a purely European.
Yes, because that is kind of mixed. I mean, it's a fake accent because it doesn't exist, but mixed British with English. But what's interesting is that she has a subtle melodic quality, an upward cadence, should I say, where it sounds like she's kind of singing at the end of her sentences. And even that way of speaking could indicate that a person is optimistic and kind. Maybe that's with singing. What I find is that when people speak, and unfortunately, I have a few friends that do this, and they're guilty of being people pleasers, which is, I think, something they have to develop over time, is that people that are people pleasers, they will speak to you. And if you notice, the end of their sentences, the tone sounds like they're asking a question, like they're kind of asking for approval.
That's true.
So do you understand? So it's like they're kind of asking like they will they can't, they could try and confront someone and say a confronting statement, but the way they'll tune it into a question makes it seem, it could even be manipulative if you think about it. Trying to frame it as getting another person to say yes. But I think it's a very people-pleasing trait.
That was probably
Yeah.
the case, especially when she was with dominant men like Roman, who she felt
Roman was a
unsure
dominant
around.
man.
Well, compared to her, when he was with her, yeah, I think she saw him that way because he tended
She
to dominate
did.
conversations. And I think it's
Yeah.
been written that she was pretty insecure around him and his friends and things because he did have this kind of magnetic quality that kind of dominated a room. And she didn't feel necessarily secure all the time in expressing her opinions around him because she felt like he
Well,
was so much smarter, which isn't necessarily the case.
the appeal with Roman was that he was a European film director. He seemed very cultured. He seemed to know a lot about cinema. And at the
Which he did.
time, the only way for an actress to move forward at the time was to get married to a director and stuff. And that would have protected her from all the other men in the industry as well. So it was kind of like a safety net. But I think her biggest insecurity with Roman was it probably began, which was when she initially resented him, was when they began working together on the set of The Fearless Vampire Killers, because he was very strict with her. He was very rude to her. He would make her do 100 takes.
Yeah, she
He
didn't
was
like
very
him at
tough on
first.
her.
She did not like him
Yeah.
at first,
Well, he was very tough on her, and he maybe
as he
even
has a
made her
history of
feel
being.
that she wasn't, yeah, and probably made her feel that she wasn't good at acting, didn't have good acting ability.
Well, and
So
again,
that
in the
sort of
spirit
thing.
of not
Yeah.
deifying, not demonizing, he's a complicated figure, especially back then. I don't know how he's still alive. He's 91 or 2 years old. Back then, at least, he was a very complicated figure. A lot of devoted fan pages and fans of Sharon, not to jump too far ahead, but they try to make that marriage look idyllic and wonderful. And we know that was not always the case, or even mostly the case. Greg King, in his book, which we talked about before, really was the one to challenge that idea that they had a really happy marriage and that she wasn't unhappy with a lot of his philandering, because he wasn't exactly discreet or selective in terms of the women he chased around while being married, which is a pretty loathsome thing to do. And that hurt her. That hurt her. And I'll show you, that's in this book here. And I'll show some more as we go on. I showed this one before. This is the Greg King book, generally regarded, at least by us, as one of the best sources for information on her life. And this is long out of print, as you know. This came out in 1999. It's 25 years old plus. You can still find copies online if you look hard enough, and you can get Kindle versions of it. But even though this has the unfortunate title of Sharon Tate and the Manson murders, this really, I think, is the best chronology of her life that I've been able to find. If you want to know,
And who recommended that book to you?
You did, of course.
I did.
It is, and after having read
it is
it
a good book,
couple
though.
times, this is a fair and balanced account of her life. And he took a lot of crap for this because he challenged some of those existing notions that, her life was idyllic all the time and she had a perfect marriage. No, Roman did some bad stuff to her, and it's corroborated in this book by several sources. It's very worthwhile reading, as you originally planned.
I would say with Roman, though, not to make this about Roman, but I will, if there's a way for me to kind of defend him in a sense. I'm not defending him, but he was a very flawed person. And I think it's very easy
we all are, yeah.
Exactly. I think it's very easy to blame. He's not the first person on this planet who has cheated multiple times on a partner. He's not
especially
going to be
back
the last.
then.
This is
Especially
the human
back then.
experience. Exactly. Especially in, yeah. So the thing with Roman is that we have to remember this man is significantly very short, feels naturally, it's that Napoleonic complex. In his defense, Sharon always had her ex-boyfriend around, and they remained to be good friends. So that doesn't make a guy feel exactly 100% like you're a beautiful girl. You have your ex-boyfriends around, and you're still friends with them. You hang out with them. Like it's not.
And plus, Steve McQueen was there. Steve McQueen was there a lot of the time. The biggest movie star on the planet back then. That all the women.
Right.
So, and
Right.
also being fair to Roman, Roman is a brilliant filmmaker, brilliant. I mean,
Absolutely.
he's made some movies that I don't think anybody else could make. They're
Absolutely.
cerebral, they're
But
intelligent, they're layered. He's a brilliant.
right. But the problem with Roman Polanski, which is what no one seems to address, is that this is a man who lost his mom in
Yes,
Auschwitz,
yeah,
right?
very traumatic
He
childhood. Yeah.
lost his mom. He lost his mom. So this wasn't easy for him.
No,
Um, and then he eventually loses his wife. So the two main figures that he has in his life, um, were just, he lost two women
mhm,
essentially. And also, what I found very interesting was that when he was filming Macbeth, there's very interesting in 1971. There's very interesting takes. They're on IMDb, and it's very gruesome description. I mean, he was telling a young
yes, I know where
actress
you're
to
going with
pretend
this.
to play dead, and
Mhm,
then he asked her what her name was, and then she replied Sharon.
yeah,
Um, People were telling him how gruesome the film was, and he said, "If you think this was gruesome, you should have seen my house last summer."
yeah.
Um, not knowing about any of that, but so Roman didn't have it easy. Like he lost his
No, not at all.
mom to
And
to the war,
again, going
and
back to not
yeah,
demonizing or deifying, we
right.
don't, and it's not our place, and we don't want to judge. Obviously, we don't know the ins and outs of somebody's relationship with their husband or wife. Do we know the true
Hmm.
story? No, we never will, and it's nobody's business. It's not really
Hmm.
crucial to our story either. I think the point that King was making was that it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. I mean, there were issues in that marriage, which there are in every marriage. And Sharon was really hurt by his behavior.
Hmm.
I would guess that since then he has evolved and become a different person. I don't know. We don't know. We don't know these people. We don't have any connection to them directly, and
Yeah.
we
And
don't want to
also,
judge.
and also something that I want to mention for people that are listening, to the ones that are listening, is that I'm not interested. I'm not going to be elaborating on her relationships, who she dated, her private
No,
life. None of that is necessary. I'm actually focusing on like her acting career, things that she did, her personality, her achievements. All of this wishy-washy, who she dated, who she was involved with, is something I'm not interested in. And if there's anything that I should mention, just a personal opinion, I don't think that marriage was faithful on both ends. I
well,
believe they were two
we know that, we know that.
completely different people
Mhm.
in that marriage. He had his affairs, she had her affairs. I don't believe they were, but
Well, we know he had at
yeah,
least one while in Europe with Christopher Jones. Was that his name?
right,
But again,
right,
like you said, that's beyond the scope really of where we want to focus. So maybe we should look
yeah,
at like the arc of her life, which is pretty remarkable, and just
yeah,
briefly go through all the things that she had to overcome to get where she was
yeah.
in an age
And
when
I
social
think,
media didn't exist, cell phones
right,
didn't exist.
right.
You had to work your way
But
up the
like,
old way.
yeah, and I think it's really important to talk about the voice aspect. And in terms of articulation, you might know more about this. I know that you like to do these fun intros, introducing me, especially in these opening segments. So I think it's time that Miss Kilberg introduces Tim Chessman. So Tim Chessman is an excellent voice actor, and he does voice coaching as well. And he
Well,
can more or less do every single person. I got him to send me like voice notes and recordings of him doing Sharon. And
oh, that was,
despite being a
jeez.
guy, his impression is probably better than 90% of Hollywood
Well, no, it
depictions of
wasn't. Well, that's
Sharon.
very kind of you, but it
So,
wasn't that. Oh boy, I wasn't prepared for that. That was a while
oh, it
ago.
was good. It was good
It
though,
wasn't an
despite being a
impression so much
man.
as just a modeling a way of speaking. So I'm trying to remember that. But and not, I'm
Yeah,
not, will never sound like her. It's not going to happen. But she had a very light and breathy way of talking, and she threw in,
absolutely.
a
So,
lot. And I was, I
mhm.
grew up in Texas, but I spent time in Europe. Just very lilting, I think is one of the best ways to put it.
That's it. You
Lilting.
know what? That's it. And also, if there's anything that I would tell Teresa, I would advise Teresa, it would probably be for the voice, light tone, focus on maintaining exactly what you said, a soft, warm quality,
Well,
vocal
and watch
quality.
all the interviews you can find that are out there, and there are some pretty good ones that are readily
And
available.
add like you
Yeah,
said, a subtle lilt like
yeah.
at the end, so it's kind of like singy, and
She was
also
a
like
remarkable
staying.
person. She was a remarkable person. Again, not to
Yeah,
deify her and make her this perfect angel, but they broke the mold when they made Sharon Tate. They really did, because, she was born in 1943 in Dallas, spent and moved all over the world because of her father was a military intelligence officer in the army. So she went, and I might be wrong about this chronology, so correct me if I get it wrong, but they spent some time in Texas. They moved to, I think,
Italy.
Central California, then Washington
Yeah.
State, where she won that
Yes.
Miss Richmond contest,
Washington.
and
Hmm.
then I think back to California and then to Italy in the early 60s, like 60 or 61. Spent her high school years at the American high school, right,
Right. Yes.
where she developed a lot of her European sensibility, and then was
Yes.
discovered visiting a boyfriend on the set of Barabbas, right? Wasn't that it? And then was hired to play
Yes.
an extra. And then
Hmm.
Jack Palance took her out and probably tried to hit on her, but it's another
I
story.
mean, Tim, I don't believe these. We have to remember that all of these people, whether they're musicians or actors, everyone kind of creates a breakout story. I got discovered here, I fell into here, I fell into that. I don't 100% believe in that, because she did struggle a lot to get into acting. It's not like
Yeah, and
she
that was
saw this
just as an
gorgeous,
extra
handsome
role.
actor who was
Yeah.
famous and he saw Sharon and said, wow, she's gorgeous, you should be in movies. I don't
No, no,
necessarily
no. I
believe
don't
that. I
think
do
that's
believe
true either. That's not.
doing
She
it as
did have
coaching,
she was
because,
an extra in that movie.
and
Just
also in the early aspects of her career, she used Paul Tate's, her father's governmental networks, to get her featured in newspapers.
that's.
So, right? So, and I
I don't think there
yeah.
was a lot of objection. I think they probably willingly did that because she was so beautiful and thought it would be a good
Hmm.
publicity. But yeah, then here's the interesting thing too. I think that was in the King book, was that in 1960s money, okay, Filmways and Ransohoff put close to $1 million in 1960s money. So we're talking like 10 million today into her training and acting preparation. So we're talking, fitness classes, voice classes, acting lessons, singing lessons, dancing lessons. Filmways put in a substantial, especially for the time, amount of money into her training. So like you said before, they wanted her to be the next big thing. They wanted her to be the next Marilyn Monroe, which even she said was never going to happen. She wanted to be her, not a Marilyn knockoff. And she said that very early.
Hmm.
So the investment in her future was substantial for back then.
Yeah. And like we mentioned, I believe I touched upon this briefly last time. If you notice in the early photo shoots that she did that were largely invested and I guess directed by Filmways and MGM in terms of promoting her, she had very 1950s makeup, cat eye makeup, and it's very reminiscent of them taking all the starlets following Monroe's death in 1962 to try and emulate a new Marilyn Monroe-esque figure. And it's funny how you see her, I guess, career trajectory, or maybe the style of the times changing over the years at that period, going from that very 1950s style cat eye to more 60s twiggy aesthetics and then something more natural. But besides that, I think this was another issue that I had with Margot's performance in terms of her voice and not sounding like Sharon. And I really tie that down to voice and articulation and the way in which you move your expressions. Because I think I didn't kind of follow through what I wanted to mention much earlier when we started. It's that I don't necessarily think an actor has to look exactly like the person they're portraying. But
No.
if you really want to look like someone, what you should do is focus on their facial expressions and the way they move their face, the muscles they use on their face, and you will begin to look more like a person through their facial expressions, not necessarily sharing the same features.
Yeah, that's the whole school of thought behind
And
that. Which
I think if there's something I would encourage Teresa, it would be, or any actress who I guess hopes to play Sharon Tate in the future. If someone like Ryan Murphy decides to use another Manson Sharon Tate storyline, which he has done more than once now in his American Horror Story series, it's that the actress has to stay relaxed, because if you're relaxed and you can keep pacing and avoid overly exaggerated articulation. And it all has to do with the way you control your voice, which is very important. And in the Eye of the Devil documentary, what I find very interesting, which was something that it took me a while to notice, and I only noticed it after I began looking into voice exercises in my own life as an actor myself. Using your tongue and pulling your tongue out really relaxes your mouth, especially if you struggle with having a very tense mouth or lips, which is something that I personally struggle with, and photographers tell me this as well, is that Sharon would always pull her tongue out. And even if you see behind the scenes of like her being on photo shoots and you see like footage, you'll always see her sticking her tongue out, and it's her trying to relax her mouth, which is interesting because that's a skill I discovered through looking at voice training. I don't know if you know about this. You probably know better things than me.
No, that's
because
true.
you're
There's a lot of techniques like that, and I
Yeah.
didn't know that she did
So,
that. That's an interesting.
So I found it interesting because I finally understood. And the reason when it hit me was when I was using clips of the All Eyes on Sharon Tate documentary. Not sure if I said that the time, not Eye of the Devil, All Eyes of Sharon Tate
Yeah, that's the one.
documentary.
Yeah.
I noticed that part when I was writing it into one of the episodes, and I was like, oh my God, I know exactly what she's doing here. So now whenever I see her pulling her tongue out, I know she's trying to relax her mouth.
She was more serious about her work than probably she gets credit for. It's speculation as to whether or to what extent she would have continued working after her baby was born. Greg King talks about her wanting to sign on for the story of O, which was a big book, I guess, back then. And
I remember that. The letter, there was a letter as well.
Yeah, he chronicles that lunch on that day of August the 8th with Joanna Pettit, with her not wanting to finish her full lunch because she needs to maintain her figure so that she can go back to work. So it's speculation as to how her career may have evolved. I don't think, based on all that she would have stopped working. I think she would have continued to work. But I don't think there's any question that for at least a few years, her baby would have been her priority. And things would have shifted. But she was a more serious person about her craft than I think people recognize.
I also think she would have had a second child like a decade later.
Who knows?
With another man, but I don't think she would have gotten married again.
Hard to say.
Be honest.
No, we can speculate. And again, it's the of her whole life.
Because it's the 70s as well. You have to remember it's the 70s. So it's not like they were very strict on you have to get married. You have like things were getting, it was a very liberal community until AIDS in the 80s hit. Sorry, I can't make dark jokes here, but sorry, let's just forget what I said.
No, that's when that came into being.
I mean, that's when things had to anyway, but it's birth of the taboo in the 80s. But what's funny is that we always talk about something that Tim and I always do for people who are listening, is that we always kind of talk about what Sharon would have been like if she was alive in the 80s. And I always say that because her last film was a European film and she was into European cinema a lot, I always say that she would have been on an 80s American comedic sitcom, and she would have like bushy, like big hair, like puffy hair. And she'd wear those awesome, what do you call them? The shoulder pads, the 80s shoulder pads. I love the 80s shoulder pads. You know what I'm talking about? Big. That's how I feel like she would, something like Twin Peaks, like Peggy Lipton was on Twin Peaks. So maybe Sharon could have done a guest appearance. I don't know.
And again, she always said that she wanted to be a Carol Lombard type, a beautiful woman who had comedic timing. And she had that. If you watch The Wrecking Crew specifically, she kind of steals that movie because she is funny in it. She's beautiful and all that, but she is funny. She has great timing in that with her pratfalls and stuff.
Yeah.
It's a fun
her comedic
movie.
Timing, yeah.
And you see it a little bit more in the 12+1. But she had a real gift for being comedic, and that takes a lot of talent to pull that.
But also, I think also something that MGM kind of really tried to do by getting her into European films and then bringing her back to the US and trying to brand her into Malibu. The people should also know that the Malibu Barbie was based off of Sharon Tate's character in Don't Make Waves. But I think her status, should I say, as a rising European / American crossover star, I think that helped her a lot, especially early on where she was cast in Romans, The Fearless Vampire Killers, which was a European film. Like I do really think MGM and the Filmways really tried to brand her into that crossover, to just make her more appealing to the American film market instead of just saying, here's another American actress, she's right from our city, you know, whatever. But I guess if there's anything else that I would say, the best way to understand Sharon, especially if you're an actress looking to portray her, and what Tim and I generally more or less would encourage Teresa to do, and encourage anyone who's interested in looking into Sharon to do, is study her work, watch her films and her interviews. And maybe I might keep this more generic and not just talk about Sharon. If you're portraying a real person, voice exercises are very important. And I'm going to let Tim talk about this in more detail because it's actually his area, to match their vocal tones, especially for Sharon, light, breathy tones and soft articulation. Margot didn't have that in the film. Her voice was,
I think she got closer than anyone else bothered to try to get, because a lot of the other ones were really bad. I think she got closest, but there's always room for improvement. And I think that needs to be an aspect that's given more attention. And Jay Sebring too. Jay Sebring was grew up in the Midwest. So he had kind of a sharper way of speaking, more emphasis on the consonants. You know, if you watch his hair salon videos where he's giving tutorials, you can see him the way he speaks. Like, it doesn't matter the frame of the face, because we want to concentrate on the outline of the hair, because that's what really matters.
That's really good. That's really good.
The voices that, now there are certain actors who are very good at that. Daniel Day-Lewis being one, changes his voice for every role.
Daniel Day-Lewis is the best actor of all time. I don't think
there's a case to be made
for Margot Robbie to be compared to Daniel Day-Lewis, or any actor for that matter. Daniel Day-Lewis is like here.
If you want like the quintessential example of somebody who really works to get a voice right, he does. That, I mean, we're coming up on 47 minutes. Should we stop and come back for part 2? And your screen just went really dark too.
Yeah, it's because of the blue lights. It's fine. I'll stay on for 3 minutes just to turn it to the 50-minute mark. But here's the thing, Tim. With Margot Robbie is someone who works with a dialect coach and an acting coach. She moved to Los Angeles. She moved to California with an acting coach and a dialect coach, and she works with them on every single film that she does. So the fact that she had a dialect coach and they didn't really look into Sharon Tate 100% to get that voice on point when they could have, because if you're working with a professional, you better get the best.
That's fair.
It wasn't. It could have been better. And you know what else is important about voices, Tim? It's, you have to understand the subtext behind a person's voice, especially when it comes to acting, because Tate encompassed, let's just say, innocence. I don't like to use that word, but you know, innocence and optimism. That's how people remembered her, right?
Sure.
And that's the natural energy that she encompassed. So an actress portraying Sharon Tate needs to project that energy when speaking, because your voice should indicate things about your personality. And if you're a character and your personality is written in one way, a great way to show who your character is through your voice alone, right?
Yeah. Which is why I think the best of them, men and women, make that a significant priority when they're playing roles, particularly living people. And there's an overlooked one too, not to get too far off subject, but there was a movie came out about 30 years ago called Hoffa with Jack Nicholson and Danny DeVito. It was one of the early what you call biopics before that word was even used. And Jack does some very subtle appearance and voice changes to model Jimmy Hoffa. If you're not paying attention, you think it just sounds like Jack Nicholson, but he makes these subtle changes for the role in the movie so that he really kind of becomes that character. Same thing with DiCaprio as Howard Hughes in The Aviator. He makes subtle changes so that he kind of melds into Howard Hughes with the way he speaks. The big time, heavy hitting pros, make that a priority when playing a character, getting the voice right, like getting Vince Bugliosi's voice right, which is a high priority for me when that role rolls around.
Yes.
Because he had a certain manner of speaking and a certain gesture. And he'd go, as you know, well, this was this case. And when they went to the Tate house, they screwed up all the evidence. And I had to get on the cop, make sure they did their jobs right. And I was carrying all these different weights. So he had a very specific way of speaking too. And that needs work because it's been a while. But again, making that a priority.
Yeah. But also, I think, because you mentioned DiCaprio, what's very interesting about Leo is that I noticed that with Rick Dalton, I can't remember which is which because it's been a while since I've seen the film, I guess, or the scenes, is that he has, he speaks with a stutter, I believe, when he's out of character.
Yeah.
And then in character, he speaks without a stutter to kind of
some
show
of
his...
some of the stuttering he does too in the role. I think that's to reflect the character's uncertainty about his own career.
Or it might be...
Like, have you ever seen an Italian Western? They're awful. It's a farce. They're real. The best ones are really good at that. We're at 50 minutes. Should we pause and come back?
Yes, we should.
Okay. We'll come back for part 2.
We should. And it's gotten really dark on my end. So
yeah, we'll have to figure. That's a little spooky there. Oh my God. What's going on over there?
It's my blue lights, my beautiful blue lights from my balcony. They come up at 6 p.m. every day.
Oh, that's good. That's a very David Lynch.
And the whole building shines. You could be driving your way to my apartment complex and you'll see my blue lights.
Oh, that is wild. Okay, we'll come back for part 2 to be continued.
Sure.